Hi, it's Penny here, and today we're going to be doing the second half of my August reading wrap-up. I already did a video where I talked about all the young adult and middle grade books that I read. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the adult books that I read. As usual, I am going to do this book battle style, which means that I will pair up all the books and battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month, or at least the best adult book of the month, and then I will pair that up against Mr. Impossible, which won the YA book battle for August, and then we will see what was really the best book that I read in August. Now, I will leave timestamps down below if you want to jump to a particular section. Quite a weird collection this month. There is a section of like horror books with a weird thriller type book thrown in there. But then as well, we've got a science fiction, a fantasy, and a contemporary. So our first battle for round one is going to be between Tomie by Junji Ito and Into the Darkness by Lee Murray. So I've read a few books by Junji Ito in the past. He writes really weird horror manga, and I've really loved some of his other works. This one, I did like it. So we're following this girl named Tomie, and I think the synopsis frames her up as like a succubus. But basically, pretty much every man falls in love with her. Tomie doesn't have a lot of time for them except for when they can give her things. And eventually these men always end up wanting to kill her. Unfortunately, when Tomie has like emotional or physical trauma, she starts breaking up and splitting into multiple versions of herself. And she can kind of like regenerate. It does get very scary, and I feel like there could be infinite stories about Tomie because it's kind of almost never ending. That said, what I really liked about Uzumaki, for example, by Junji Ito, is that it kept escalating and just getting weirder and weirder through the different stories. Whereas Tomie, I feel like it kind of peaked about halfway through the book and then it didn't really escalate from there. And I was really hoping things would get super, super weird. They just kind of got like regular super weird. So I liked Tomie. I definitely think if you like Junji Ito, it's worth a read. But I would also say that Uzumaki still stands as my favorite of his work. Then the other book in this battle is Into the Darkness by Lee Murray. This is like a little short novella in Lee Murray's Tanya McKenna series. So in the first book, we basically had this creature horror, some army guys, some scientists, some locals out in the bush in New Zealand running into this horrible creature. In this little novella, they're basically taking some time to relax in France, this guy and this girl that survived from the first book. And while they're there, they run into this horrible creature. The first little bit of this was super intense and I was really into it. But then after that, I didn't really get much from it. I realized that what I really liked from the first book is like all this anticipation being built, all the different plot threads interweaving, and the relationships that were building up. And in this one, because our two main characters kind of get separated and one of them is hanging out with this bunch of French soldiers, none of whom speak English, so obviously there wasn't really any relationship building there. Also, it was super short, like I think like 30 pages, so there wasn't really a chance to build up that anticipation. There wasn't really much interrelating the two plot lines. And so overall, I ended up a little bit bored. However, I will say that at the end of this novella, there was like a little synopsis of the next two books in this series, and I really want to read those. They sounded super exciting. So even though I didn't really enjoy the novella, it still had the intended effect of making me excited to continue the series. So if I'm putting these two books up against each other, it's actually a little bit difficult because there were elements I liked of both, but at the same time, both of them did disappoint me a little bit. But overall, I would say I was less disappointed in Tomie, and even though I wanted it to be super amazing, it was still like regular weird amazing, right? Like it was still good. I think if I hadn't already had such high expectations of Junji Ito from reading some of his other stuff, I probably would have really liked Tomie if it was like the first thing I'd read by him. So I guess I'll put Tomie through to the next round. Then for our next battle, we have Exhalation by Ted Chiang up against Child of the Grove by Tanya Huff. So Exhalation is a short story anthology. I picked this up after reading Ted Chiang's other short story anthology, Stories of Your Life and Others, which I really loved, and so I had high hopes going into this as well, but this one delivered exactly what I was expecting from it. It's a whole bunch of these weird stories, investigating really weird ideas, and just they're really smart and they ask such smart questions. Some of the stories really made me think. Some of them made me really emotional. There is one which is basically a parrot asking, why are we looking in space for intelligent life when we could just be talking to parrots? and it was kind of beautiful. There were also quite a few in there around parenting and kind of asking questions about how we raise our children and the potential effect of technology, I guess. I don't know. There were so many stories and I loved almost every single one. There were possibly one or two that didn't quite work for me, but I find it very rare to find a short story anthology where you love every single story, and this is definitely one of the best. I almost loved every single one. I would also say that stories of your life and others I found a bit like mentally challenging. Some of the stories really I had to think and like really pay attention to understand what was going on, whereas these ones I felt were a little bit easier on the brain. So if you think stories of your life and others is a little bit intimidating, maybe Exhalation is a good place to start instead. Then I read Child of the Grove by Tanya Huff. So this story is all about a world where wizards basically ruined the world and then destroyed themselves, except one. And then all the elder races kind of come together with this big convoluted plan to create Crystal, who is another wizard who'll be able to take on this other wizard that's not a very nice guy. What I will say is kind of the first half of the book is this whole thing where the elder races are trying to set up for Crystal to be created. So it was really weird because it kind of spanned multiple generations and I felt like we were never getting to the actual point of the story. I do think it explained quite well like how much effort had gone into creating Crystal. But really, that whole first half of the book, I just wanted to be reading about Crystal. So I was a bit frustrated it took a while to get there. As well, I would say once we did get there, it was a little bit slow. But in the end, I did find the ending very satisfying. So it was a bit of a journey, but I think in the end, I did enjoy it. Still, if I'm putting Child of the Grove up against Exhalation, which I loved, I don't think it's a surprise that I'm going to put Exhalation through to the next round. Okay, so this next round is going to be the semi-finals, even though we've got a couple of extra books added in there. And our first battle is going to be between Tomie by Junji Ito and Someone Like Me by Carey. So we've talked about Tomie already. Let's talk about Someone Like Me. This was a really weird story, and so there's only so much I can talk about without spoiling it. But basically, we're following two characters. One is this mother who has been a victim of domestic abuse, and more recently she's been having trouble with her ex-husband. She has this altercation with him during which she feels like she's not in control of herself, which really leads to her questioning a lot of her experiences. We also have this 16-year-old girl who becomes friends with this woman's son, and she, when she was younger, was kidnapped by this man, and ever since then she's been very traumatized and having quite a lot of psychological issues for which she's been having counseling. And she has this problem as well where sometimes there are changes around her, like she remembers things being a certain way and suddenly they're not that way. So again, she's also questioning her perception. And this got super weird and super dark. And then right at the end as well, it was super action-packed, and like I was super nervous for the characters, and just like it was great but terrifying at the same time. So I think in the end that I loved this. It was weird and I never knew exactly where it was going for so long that I feel like not confident that I loved it, but I think I loved it. So I think if I'm going to put this up against Tomie by Junji Ito, that I am going to put Someone Like Me through to the finals. Then we've got Exhalation by Ted Chiang up against The Subtweet by Vivek Shraya. So the Subtweet. This was a fairly short contemporary audiobook about these different women in the music industry and the friendships that they've formed over social media initially, and kind of like how their social media usage affects their real life friendships and their careers, I guess. Unfortunately, I found the main character very unlikable. I felt like the way they were using social media was incredibly unhealthy and toxic, and that kind of is the point of the story, but I felt like we didn't really get to any of the lessons about it until quite far into the story, and it was really just frustrating me having to like read through all these stupid things they were doing and like the way they were seeing things on social media and making assumptions about what that meant their friends were doing rather than just talking to each other. There were also like quite a lot of ideas in there about creativity that I didn't really vibe with, and I think it was kind of shown at the end that that wasn't a great way of thinking, but also maybe not. I don't know. I think as well I just kind of got disengaged from this book and didn't pay as much attention as I could have. As well, there is actually like 3 different perspective characters in this book, I think, and they all kind of sounded the same. Now, it could be that there was just one audiobook narrator for them, so they sounded the same, like their voices sounded the same, but I also feel like the writing style was very similar for all of them, so I found it kind of hard to tell sometimes which character we were actually following along with until they would talk about one of the other characters. So I don't know. I feel like people who have really unhealthy relationships with social media could maybe get something out of this book, but I just found it incredibly frustrating. So if I'm putting this up against Exhalation by Ted Chiang, again, no big surprise here. I'm going to put Exhalation through to the finals. So that means we're up to the finals, and we're going to have Someone Like Me by Carey up against Exhalation by Ted Chiang. And how am I going to decide which one I liked more? I guess if we go on what I just said before, I was like, I think I like Someone Like Me, but I can't really tell. Whereas Exhalation, I know that I loved it. And I definitely I would recommend Exhalation to anyone who enjoys science fiction and like speculative short stories. Someone Like Me, I feel like I don't know who would be the right kind of person to recommend that to. I did see on Goodreads it's got quite mixed reviews, and I think depending on what you enjoy would depend on whether you like that book, but also you can't talk about any of those things without spoiling it. So I don't know, if you like weird, dark stuff, you might like it, but also it might not be weird or dark enough for you. Anyway, regardless, I think that I'm going to pick Exhalation as the best adult book of the month, which means that now we're going to put it up against the best YA book of August, and that was Mr. Impossible by Maggie Stiefvater. I talked more about that in the other video, but it is also a very weird book where we have people fighting to use their magical abilities up against people who believe that if they use these abilities, they're going to destroy the world. But also a lot of people just trying to live their lives in the middle of this conflict. I feel like both these books were very unique, made me think about things in ways I haven't normally thought about them. Like, I honestly don't know how either of these authors, how their brains work to come up with these kind of creations. Both of them kind of blow my mind that people can create things like this. I am definitely much more attached to the characters in Mr. Impossible, but that's because Exhalation didn't have characters that ran through the whole thing. It was just more about the plot and the ideas. Mr. Impossible does have a plot, but it's less about the plot and more about the characters and the concepts, I guess. I really don't know. I love both these books in completely different ways. I don't know how to make this decision. Where's my spreadsheet? Wow. Okay. The spreadsheet has no doubts about who the winner is. And I think, if I'm trying to understand the clues my spreadsheet is giving me, I think that Mr. Impossible did start out a little bit shaky. And in the beginning, I wasn't quite clear what direction we were going in. And I was a little bit unsure, like, does this book know what it's doing? In the end, it didn't know what it was doing, but it took a little while to get there. Exhalation, right from the first story, I was completely in it. There were only a couple of like fairly short stories that I was not that into, but by the time I got to those, because they were further into the collection, I was already in love with the story, so it didn't hurt my enjoyment too much. I think as well, if I look at my argument from the previous battle, once again, Exhalation is one that I would not hesitate recommending to people who like speculative science fiction short stories. Mr. Impossible, YA fantasy, urban fantasy. It's a weird one. Again, I do think it will only appeal to certain people who like Maggie Stiefvater's specific style of writing and who like her really weird concepts. So that means I am going to pick Exhalation by Ted Chiang as the champion of the month, the best book that I read in August. So do let me know if you have read any of the books that I talked about today, because I would love to talk with you more about them down in the comments, or let me know if you are now interested in reading any of the books that I talked about. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.